Good morning, everybody. This is John Cole coming back at you with all things chess. We're continuing an examination of hanging pawns. The past three videos, we've looked at what it's like when the side facing the hanging pawns is able to establish a blockade in front of the c-pawn before it advances next to its d-pawn brethren. We're going to move on to situations where both the hanging pawns are abreast, where they're standing next to one another, and the structural plans of how to face that. This will take up the majority of this session because there's quite a few positional factors involved. And there's a lot of different pawn breaks and piece maneuvers to consider, so this will be a pretty long portion of the course. I'm going to start by looking at examples where, when the hanging pawns are freshly formed, opportunities to immediately establish some sort of weakness or blockade with the hanging pawns. As I've said a few different times, when the hanging pawns are first formed, the first 3 to 4 moves are often crucial. If you're able to establish immediate pressure against the hanging pawns, even if they've advanced next to each other, that can often lead to some very favorable positional outcomes. If you're not able to establish that pressure very quickly, a lot of times the hanging pawns will just be a boon. So we're going to start by looking at sort of idealized examples where the side facing hanging pawns is able to establish an immediate blockade through pressure on the hanging pawns. So this is the game Sandro Mareco against Mareco-Toth. This is a game from 2012. D4, G3, Bishop E4 check. So this is another way to get into the Bogo Indian. We looked at a Bogo Indian example yesterday. This is part of my main repertoire. The nice part about the Bogo Indian is that it's pretty much a one-size-fits-all. This area right here, both knight f3, you get the Bogo there. A lot of people will play g3 as a way of getting into the Catalan. I would rather have my teeth buffed with the center than play against the Catalan, because black is just groveling for a draw on a lot of those theoretical lines. Whereas the Bogo Indian, it still has plenty of theoretical room for innovation. There's plenty of different lines and structures that black can play. I quite like it. It's not a passive opening at all. It just depends on how black plays it. Bishop d2, bishop x d2 check. This is a very passive way of playing it. I would say this is dubious. Just as a practical matter, in your own games, never start playing for a draw by move 4. If only the practical matter, typically when you start playing for a draw that early, that's when you don't get the draw, because you're not fighting for your equal share of chances. You tend to drift into very passive positions where you just get ground down endlessly. The way to secure a draw is to play actively and strongly, and fight for your share of chances in a position. Bishop x d2 check. This is popular with Ulf Andersson. He played this a lot in the 80s and 90s, and as far as I know, he still plays it. If you're Ulf Andersson, I mean, you have the technical skill to secure a draw fairly effortlessly. Otherwise, this is just sentencing black to a slightly worse position, where he doesn't really have any chance at all. The usual Bogo stuff applies. You could play a5 here. That would probably be the most popular modern choice. Queen e7 would also be pretty popular here, and this should just transpose to a normal Bogo Indian once the knight moves f3. So bishop x d2 check. It's just very passive. Don't play your openings passively. Play for your active share chances. Knight x d2, queen x d2. It's twice as popular. Basically, the idea is the knight coming to d2. It's a little bit less active than on c3. But when black plays d5, that c4 pawn's already going to be defended. So, in my opinion, it's just as viable as queen x d2. Just a different way of playing. d5, bishop g2, b6. So, this sort of highlights the positional problems caused by playing bishop x d2 check. That was black's good bishop. So, without b6, this bishop on c8 really is quite depressing. It has nowhere at all to really move to. So b6 more or less has to be played at some point to get this bishop into the game, but that's yet another time investment that black's forced into, whereas white's just actively developing, fighting for the center, gaining space. Yeah, this is just sort of a hallmark of how depressing the bishop x d2 choice was, because black has to invest this time to get his development done. Castle. Knight bd7. This is natural, but allows a couple different ways of fighting for an advantage that are pretty obvious. But the problem is, dx d4 is probably the most natural. But this is a very good Catalan position for white. Um, White has very obvious follow-up moves like rook f1. You can play b4 to gain even more queenside space, and just slowly start the squeeze up. White can play this sort of position forever without any risk at all. Knight bd7. The game choice was cx d5. Stylistically, I prefer c5 here. Just gaining extra space and pushing on. You've got the threat of c6, so black has to respond to that. So c6, and then e4. This is a very common structure for a Catalan, and usually it's a Catalan gone wrong because black really doesn't want to allow this c5 push. Just a quick. So the knight has to take. Stop the knight from coming to d6. 6. And let's just put this on the board so we can talk about the position. This is a very nice position for white. This bishop on b7 really is quite depressing. This knight is going to be threatening to hop into d6 at some point, so probably the best move would be knight e5. And then if white's able to play knight c4, that just immediately brings that knight into the killer post on d6. This is a great position for white. Cx d5, it looks to play more of a slightly favorable Queen's Gambit decline Tartakover position, which is a way of doing it, but I would stylistically prefer c5. Just try to strangle your opponent while you can and gain that space. Typically, when you can gain space, you want to do it. So cx d5 is not bad, just maybe not the most incisive. Ex 95. So basically, this position, black is fated to play c5 at some point. If he doesn't, he's just going to remain completely passive. So we're almost fated to head for a hanging pawn position. So knight e5 looks to get some minor pieces off the board in preparation for that hanging pawn position. So black plays it immediately. xd7. dxc5. So this is a mistake. Again, the moment when we first transition structures is incredibly key. This is a depressing position for black no matter what. I mean, this bishop on b7 is quite poor. We've already got two sets of minor pieces off the board, so whether we go for hanging pawns or an isolated pawn, it's unfavorable to black, because black no longer has a material on the board to really generate pressure to justify the weaknesses. Now, that said, knight f5 would be the lesser of the two evils. Queen d2, and white really wouldn't mind the double pawns because that would open up the a file for some extra play. But either way, this is a position that white can play forever. White will never lose this position. He will win X amount of time. Objectively, I think black is still within the drawing zone. I think with careful play, black can neutralize white's advantage. But this is a really depressing position. White can play this for free forever. The problem with dxc5 is that, concretely, and again, when the hanging pawns are first formed, that's an incredibly key moment. That's when you want to be immediately looking for ways to pressure the hanging pawns and to try to generate some sort of concession. If you're not able to gain that pressure, typically the side with the hanging pawns is going to be able to consolidate and start generating pressure. So knight b3, excellent move. Hits the c5 pawn. This bishop on g2 is hitting the d5 pawn as well. So this forces black into playing a very depressing move. So c4. This is just one of those positional moves that you'd rather eat garbage than play a move like this. Just it turns your pawn structure into an absolute sieve. So knight d4. Black's dark squares are completely busted. This bishop on c8 has no scope whatsoever, and never will, because these pawns are all blockaded on light squares. This is truly depressing position for black. Queen a5, this is a blank shot. This is a positional mistake. It doesn't achieve anything, and it puts the queen off sides at a time when white's going to be generating pretty strong pressure against the hanging pawns. Knight f6 is better, just putting it on the defensive hat. b3. Knight f5. This often happens in these sorts of IQP positions. It's sort of similar to a ready open in a way. When you're playing against the isolated queen pawn, you're not locked into playing against it. You can play on other parts of the board, and here white can suddenly generate some surprising kingside pressure. Just an aside, whenever you can get a knight to f5 against a castled king, or a knight to f4 against a castled white king, That is a huge boon for attack, quite often. Kasparov often said that a knight on f5 against a castle black king is worth a sacrifice pawn, and he showed that repeatedly in his own practice. Just an example, notice that bishop xa2 is very dangerous. Rook c6, and this actually loses by force. And all of a sudden, white has a winning attack. Queen a1 is threatened, which hits the bishop on a2 and the pawn on f6, which would checkmate. But knight f6 would be the best, just putting on the defensive hat, activating black's pieces, and trying to hold the position. Queen a5, it doesn't accomplish anything. b3, so the threat to the pawn on a2 is completely phantom. It doesn't accomplish anything. Rook a b8. If the queen takes, this is a mistake. Of course, if the pawn takes back, rook b1, white wins a piece. But otherwise, white's winning at least a pawn after we take on d5. Rook a b8. Knight f5. Queen c2 is a little bit more accurate, but knight f5 is perfectly fine. Rook c2. Rook f d8. This is definitely a little bit... Black is just sort of slowly drifting. Now, that's very common in these sorts of positions, because when you have a passive position like this, it's hard to play defensive chess. It's much easier to attack than it is to defend. So psychologically expecting yourself to hold a passive position is almost always incorrect, because it is so difficult to play these sorts of passive positions. That said, black should just take on b3. d4. This is one potential line. Again, this is another position where white is just slightly better. He's going to be better forever. He can play this position forever. There's no hope of counterplay for black, and white can just play this as long as he wants. This is playing for 2 results. But I would say objectively black might still be within the drawing zone, but it's going to take a little bit more accuracy than previously. But rook f d8 is just adrift. Queen c1. So now this is sort of combined efforts, and this is nice queen geometry. A knight on f5 almost always generates strong threats against a castle's black king. Now all of a sudden we're threatening the pawn on c4, and we're threatening queen g5, which wouldn't have a good response at all. h6, black has to prevent queen g5. Queen f4, so now we're threatening knight x h6, demolishing the black king side. cb, ab, queen b6, rook f c1. So now we mobilize both of our rooks. d4, this is the final mistake. 98 is incredibly passive. Again, passive defense is very hard. It's difficult to play these sorts of moves, but this would at least hold the position together temporarily. But d4 loses by force. And then rook c6, just plenty rook x f6, there's no good response. Queen x b3, and black resigned. There's just no good response whatsoever there. It's force mate, of course. But the main learning content that I want you to take away comes from this position. Again, when the hanging pawns are first formed, that's when you want to be on the lookout for favorable structural changes. So this immediate moment when black takes back on c5, that's when white wants to be on the lookout for ways to put pressure on the hanging pawns immediately. Because white does have a little bit of an edge in development, that helps him put immediate pressure on the hanging pawns. The concrete details of this position after knight b3, it forces this incredibly depressing move c4. And this is just a depressing position for black. There's really nothing good that black can do from this position other than passive defense. The pawns are blockaded in the same square as bishop, so this bishop on b7 is always going to be poor. This knight on d4 has an eternal outpost. Nothing can ever chase it away. White can play this position for free forever. So that immediate moment when the hanging pawns are first created, that's the absolute key that you want to be on the lookout for. That first 3 to 4, 3 to 5 moves when the hanging pawns are first created, that's a key moment, and that's when you want to be on the lookout for ways to put pressure on the hanging pawns and transform the structure to your favor. So instructive game, we're going to continue looking at these hanging pawn positions. My name is John. I'll see you later.